right, welcome back. I'm your host, Michael Stamatinos with the Advancing Healthcare Innovation Show. And if you're new to us, we're super excited to have you here. We also happen to be crazy passionate around healthcare innovation and adoption. And if this is your first time tuning in, welcome. Let me tell you just a little bit about what we do here. We're a healthcare innovation company, and we're focused on bringing innovative stories from healthcare to real life. And our aim is bringing real people that are truly innovating within this space and giving them a platform to share their stories with the world. And we've got an incredibly action-packed year with new content, amazing interviews that have been planned. And if you haven't checked out any of the historical interviews that we've done, make sure that you go back and check those out and hit subscribe now so you can get all the new amazing content that's coming out from some of the interviews. So with that being said, I'm just super delighted to bring up Pablo Juárez, who's the director of TRIAD, the Autism Institute at Vanderbilt Kennedy Center, and he also happens to be the director of behavior analysis. So Pablo, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me. It's great to be here.
All right. So generally, before we kind of get rolling in here, I would love for the audience to maybe just get like a high level of you. You're a clinician at heart, but you also happen to be someone who has embraced innovation, and we'll dig into that. But would you mind maybe just sharing a little bit of your story to our audience? We'll get rolling.
Yeah, I mean, I come from a very humble background. Had a grandmother who worked as a teaching assistant in a special education classroom for as long as I can remember, and a grandfather who worked as a janitor in the same school. And so education's always been important to us, and family's always been important to us, but disability has kind of always been there ever since I can remember. So throughout my early life and into college, I very much was focused on disabilities. I actually went to college, University of North Texas, to become a special education teacher. Was fortunate enough to fall into the behavior analysis program there as an undergrad and completed my training there, and then started to work in various disability fields, including brain injury. Got back into a brain injury. Then I came to TRIAD, where I've been here since 2008, and really working hard to help build our programming and diversify the portfolio work we're doing, but also thinking about all of it from a very person-centered, self-determined way. So that's a very quick rundown.
Well, thanks for sharing that. And I think, from some of our previous discussions, this particular episode is something that I'm really excited about, and something that I hold near and dear, as noted in our conversation, Pablo. I mean, I've got a kiddo that's on the spectrum, understand how things are at the ground level of what that means. So I'm really looking forward to just talking a little bit about how you guys have continued to innovate. And let's maybe fast forward a little bit. So we're here in late stages of 2022, and a lot's happened over the course of the last couple of years. And I'm curious, how have you guys approached the delivery of care, garnering larger scope of access throughout this period? And I'd love to maybe hear a little bit of commentary around that.
It's a really good question, and a hard position, I think, for a lot of clinical practitioners and researchers to have been in when the pandemic really took hold. We were in a, I don't know if fortunate is the right term, but we were in a position at the time where we had really been thinking about innovation already, and especially in terms of telepractice and what we could do with telepractice. So 3-4 years before this COVID-19 pandemic, we had already started to really dig into research, conducting our own research, conducting our own clinical practices and statewide practices via telepractice. So when the pandemic started to shut everything down, we were in a fortunate position to be able to continue serving the people we were and continuing to provide the same services, but also new services, because our team was already up and ready in terms of telepractice. So it was a pretty seamless, isn't the right word, but it was a much more seamless transition for us than I think many other people. We didn't have the same learning curve, I think a lot of other folks had. And so I think it did a couple of things. One has allowed us to continue to sort of go down that path of providing services, but it also put us in this mindset of, okay, we need to really kind of push things even more than we have and really dig into that from a from an innovation standpoint. One quick example is, we had been working prior to the pandemic at developing a new telediagnostic model where we were able to diagnose children under the age of 3 or 4 via telepractice. The trick there was they would have to come into a rural clinic. And so we'd have somebody on the ground there in the rural clinic, and our psychologist would zoom in from Nashville to some rural clinic, and we'd be able to do a kind of a quick assessment that way. And that was working really well, but that wasn't a possibility when the pandemic hit. So we'd already been working on a line of research on how can we shift this telediagnostic process to be 100% telediagnostic, not require families to have to travel anywhere. And in fact, can we actually do this within their own homes? And we found that we could. So I think because of the position we were in the pandemic, we pushed that forward probably 2 or 3 years. But we had done enough sort of background to feel comfortable with where we were in terms of being able to move that straight to practice. And we trained several thousand other practitioners around the country and around the world in that process as well. So it's kind of a long-winded answer to your question, but I think we were in a position where we had already been going down the line of really telepractice-based innovation. So by the time the pandemic hit, we were able to kind of just shift and continue to move forward.
So it sounds like, the foundation had been laid. Was that an arduous process? I mean, what did you have to do to get leadership to sort of align around this concept of, let's just call it intervention at a distance and being able to do it at scale? What were some of the problems that surfaced that made you all feel like, this is the path that we have to go down? We cannot stay where we are. Can you maybe talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I'll give you an example from one of our largest programs, but it
Yeah.
fits, I think, across most of what we do, and certainly speaks to our program development philosophy. So we have a large training and technical assistance grants, actually a couple of them from the Tennessee Department of Education. One is focused specifically on autism and helping educate teachers and school personnel around the state on autism and kind of best practices in terms of education. And we have another one focused specifically on dangerous and complex behavior. And our task there is to work with students who require the highest amount of resources to remain safe in schools. And our goal is to get them to be as engaged and happy as possible within those school settings. But, we're in Nashville, the middle of the state. And we have a long state and a very rural state. And so prior to, this goes back well over a decade where we started to think, how can we really make sure that we're providing the very best care we can for families who are in far West Tennessee and often impoverished communities within inner city Memphis, and families who live in the Appalachian Mountains, far Northeast Tennessee. Very different issues, very different cultures, very different approaches, but the fact remains that they're very far from us. And if we need to go in and support a student who's engaging in let's say, high rates of aggressive and dangerous behavior, it's very hard for us to do that efficiently from Nashville. And so we started to think, how can we really develop and drive our practices in a way that allows us to provide people with as good of services in far Northeast Tennessee as we're providing here in Nashville. And so our philosophy really started to turn in terms of program development to thinking about, how do we do that well? How do we do that efficiently? How do we do that effectively? And telepractice is something that came up pretty quickly. So we were fortunate to be able to tie a large bit of our funding to sort of that idea and be able to pitch to our funder, which in this case is the state of Tennessee, that not only can we do this well, but we can do this more efficiently, more effectively. It allows us to reach many more students and actually work with more complex cases than we ever have before. So we started to lay the groundwork for that probably about a decade ago. And over that time, really started to dig in and practice and understand what the limits of telepractice are, but also push those limits in as
Hmm.
safe a way as we could. So by the
Well,
time
what
we
are some of
got,
those limits? Let's talk
well,
about some of those limits and how have you stretched them?
yeah, I mean, so some of those limits are, if we're working with a student who um, is engaging in high rates of aggression, it can be very challenging for us to provide good coaching and support from Nashville via telepractice into a classroom if we haven't done the front end work of training the staff there appropriately. So that was an initial limitation because we hadn't developed that teaching technology yet. We had just been thinking about how can we kind of shift our practice directly to telepractice. And that doesn't work in these types of complex and dangerous situations. So the next step was, okay, let's develop this coaching model and coaching technology that allows us to prepare teams for what we're going to be asking them to do, um, build confidence that they can do these increasingly complex things and ensure that there's safety for everybody involved.
Right.
And then we were able to kind of push that direction. So it was a lot of sort of, I don't want to say trial and error. It was very structured, but it was really identifying, okay, what are the limits and how are we going to push those as far as we can to ensure safety? And then what does that allow us to open the door for the next thing and kind of keep building from there?
Now you mentioned about the state of Tennessee, being a funder. I guess how having financial constraints and being able to innovate within those financial constraints. I guess what's the viewpoint on that, and what have been some of the key learnings there? Sometimes, because I think the impetus behind that question is sometimes folks use the lack of resources as an excuse on why not to innovate. In your instance, it seems as though that hasn't been the case, that despite not having maybe all the resources that you might want, doesn't necessarily preclude you from continuing to innovate. And just sort of curious as to maybe what some of the innovations within these limitations have looked like, whether it be from a result from parents, an outcome, just share a little bit if you can.
Yeah, I think we had to think, we at first were really trying to think of what are the most like efficient technological systems we can send into a location. So we had these sort of telepractice packages that we would send out to schools and homes. One was like a robot arm that we could control at a distance. Um, One was this like big pan tilt zoom camera that we had to go and install like in a school or in a clinic and hardwire. And there are a lot of different things we tried and attempted. And ultimately what we figured out is like, we don't need most of those things. Right. And in fact, it's going to really decrease equity in terms of who can actually access our services if we're requiring all these things, or
Yeah.
even the ability for people to set these up in homes, have Wi-Fi and all these other sort of precursor technological pieces and understanding people have to have. So we have started to one just ask people, what do you have, and is it something you're able to access? Um, does it have a webcam? Does it have audio? And if so, let's try that first. Do you have Wi-Fi? Is it restricted for you to use Wi-Fi? If it is, we're going to send you a couple of hotspots and you can pick whichever one works the best. Um, but that's really been sort of where we've gone to baseline instead of just assuming we're going to need to send all these things out. So we have kind of the most control that we want over the visual and audio. Um,
Yeah.
let's just work with them with what they have. And if we have to send them something, we've just started sending like, mini iPads or other sorts of things that we can set up, and that typically is enough. So I think that's one of the things that we've had to kind of work backwards on is, okay, we don't need all these super high tech things. We just need to really figure out what is it that they can use and they're comfortable with, and let's go with that.
I want to switch gears a little bit because you mentioned about how you all have really focused on the coaching piece. So I'll call it, train the trainer per se. What when people are delivering care, I guess, is there a lot of clinical variation within the discipline? And how does that, how did you guys kind of overcome that through this coaching?
There is a lot of clinical variation, especially in the field of behavior analysis. In fact, I think our field is in a pretty poor state right now in terms of the way we practice as a field. Um, and a lot of that has happened for a number of reasons that we can get into or not. But I think that what we're seeing on the ground is with the behavior analysts that we tend to come in contact with that are already working in schools or already working with particular students. Um, we end up looking at skill deficits that they have as behavior analysts and figuring out how to kind of plug those holes and help build them up in a way that they can then sort of be the on the ground experts in the best way possible. But I think, what we tend to think about in terms of behavior analysis is coming in and or what people tend to think of in terms of behavior analysis is people coming in to decrease these sort of challenging behaviors. Where really we should be coming in to build skill and develop skill. And that's a whole different
Mm.
mindset. And that's a whole different culture in terms of what we're after. So for example, a school team may call us and say, we want you to come in and work with this student to um, uh, stop engaging in non-compliant behavior, right? They just are not following directions and they're not doing what we want. And so a lot of behavior analysts can go in and teach somebody through various means how to be compliant and how to follow directions. But there's a lot of safety issues with that. There's a lot of questions around self-advocacy and self-determination that if we don't pair all those things well, then we're missing a lot. The other big thing is if we go in as clinicians to a school who's asked us to come in and work specifically on non-compliance and teach somebody to be compliant, once we get to that point, we found, and this is a natural thing, this is not a judgment on these schools, but they're ready for us to go out because we've kind of done the job. Where if we can shift sort of the goals that we're working towards to be more skill acquisition based, where we're focusing on things like engagement, compliance, and safety, which across those three categories, we can almost fit everything that anybody wants to address within compliance, within engagement, cooperation, or safety. And that switches the mindset. And that allows us to go in and lift the ceiling that compliance has and really kind of the sky's the limit at that point. And we can engage teachers in the things that they want to be doing, they want to be teaching. And so
Right.
that allows us to tap into what their natural strengths are and their natural inclinations are, and hopefully move towards a culture change. But I think that's been a big thing that we've really kind of focused on is what do the teachers want to be doing? What do they actually want? And how can we be more precise about both of those things in terms of our goal development and then subsequent development of whatever interventions we're going to put in place?
Yeah, I mean, it sounds like you're taking a more holistic point of view on this, not just focusing in on one particular deficit. You're saying, look, let's look at the whole environment, who's involved, and based on that, kind of put together and map a game plan. And you're right, because look, some of these kiddos that are in a school, like they're going to need to have skills outside of school. They're only in school a certain amount of time, and just sort of being a parent, the majority of the time is outside of school, right? The
Yeah.
majority of life is outside of school. How do you develop those skills? So it's nice to know that you all are innovating, not just in one particular type of setting, but giving people the skills. And I think that's another important point to note is how are you also equipping parents? Because I can just say the amount of books I've read, seminars I've attended. And I don't necessarily say that I'm like a super parent or something like that. My wife is, but I'm not. Um, how do you equip parents? How has the program innovated in that respect, whether it be through education? If you can maybe share some stories, some successes around that, would be great.
Yeah, I mean, we take a lot of approaches to that. So just within our school-based work, talk about the behavioral work again, our one of the first people we contact every time we take on a case are the parents. And actually we contact whoever the caregivers are prior to even accepting the case to make sure that their goals are aligned with the team goals, that they have the support and resources they need. And if not, we try to dig in and identify, okay, what is it that you need? And we'll provide that to you at home too. Because there's only so far it's going to go. If we can be really successful in schools, we have to be able to provide that same level of success at home to really be able to make sure that that student is able to live a happy, relaxed, and engaged life. And so it's got to be that holistic approach. The other important thing that we talk about with caregivers, by the way, is medical background of the child, mental health background. All those types of things have to play in there for a lot of different reasons. And then we engage with them oftentimes via telepractice. There are also sort of family training models we have where we pull people together from across the country or across our state in various ways, sometimes hybrid options, and kind of have these mix of sort of a support group and a training program for parents. And so there's a lot of different ways that we sort of think through training caregivers, and it's one of the most important pieces of what we do.
I'm curious just to maybe even get your perspective on this from, I guess, stigmas that are associated with folks that are on the have neurodevelopmental differences. And I'm not sure if I'm using that buzzword in the right way, but that's something new that I saw. But before, I was told, someone that is neurotypical or not typical. As as a professional, can you maybe talk about stigmas that are associated with this, or things that occur from clinicians onto parents? Because that was something that I personally sort of sensed sometimes.
Yeah.
Just curious if you have a perspective on that.
Well, I have a perspective on that as a clinician and also as a parent of a child with autism. And I think that we as a society, this is an ableist society by nature, and that means that we have a lot of cultural norms and policies that directly and negatively impact people with disabilities, and folks who are neurodivergent often engage in behaviors that just look different than what we expect, right? So there used to be this idea that if a student or a child or somebody was engaging in just some self-stimulatory behavior, so maybe hand flapping or rocking or pacing or sort of verbal repetition, that we needed to figure out how to stop that, how to get them to stop that, so that way they could fit in and sort of normalize. What we know now is that oftentimes those types of stims actually bring things like anxiety reduction, or they just feel really good. Or oftentimes these stims also allow people to stay engaged, right? So one of the things that we find often is that folks will want us to come in and work with a child or a student who's engaging in some sort of self-stimulatory behavior that's non-harmful. And one of the reasons is because they're not engaged. They're not paying attention in class. And we can go through some things, and often what we find is they actually are paying attention. And actually, if we were to get them to try to concentrate on not making those movements and not doing those things, they wouldn't be paying attention. And so a lot of it comes down to education and just, changing our culture over time. But there is this sort of huge risk in clinical practice of developing programming that teaches people how to camouflage and mask who they are, to not talk about the things they're interested in, to not engage in the things that make them feel good or help them feel less anxious or stressed. So there are some of those stigmas. I think they're starting to decrease quite a bit from a social standpoint. And a big reason for that is we've got lots of self-advocates and advocates out there who are doing a lot of really important work of sharing that information and educating us as clinicians, as parents, as society members. So I I am a firm believer in working closely with autistic and neurodivergent people in our work. In fact, we have an advisory group that's made up of autistic and neurodivergent people who guide a lot of our work. And much of our practice is based on things that we've learned directly from the community. We actually call our behavioral approach community informed practice, because we've talked to several groups of people to really learn those things. What are the things we shouldn't be doing?
Right.
And a lot of it often comes down to don't teach people to conform, right? Teach them that it's okay to be individual, that it's okay to live a self-determined life. And those tend to be the most important things.
Yeah, it sounds like you're just saying, look, as a society, we need to be a little bit more, have a little bit more grace, and be a little bit more in allowance of some of these types of stemming behaviors, which again, I think most that don't have a neurodivergent kiddo would just be like, well, what's going on over there? but for those of us that sort of live in or in this world every single day, it's just a normal part of life.
Yeah.
So anyhow, moving on. I know we're kind of getting towards the end of our time here, but I just want to just ask, I mean, what are you most proud of and what's been accomplished today, and what are you most excited about, peering and looking into the future?
Well, I am most proud of our work across the entire state. I mean, when I first started, and this isn't just because of me, we have a lot of great people here, and I've had a lot of great people here for a long time, but we were sort of regional specific. But to be able to really engage in technology and build a team that's really excited about innovation and is always thinking about, well, we don't have to do it that way. There's a better way to do it. We just need to figure it out or find the right pieces. And we're always tinkering. Um, so it's a very creative, compassionate group who truly is invested in doing what's best for the people we're serving. And I just am proud to come to work every day and work with everybody I get to work with, because they're all proud to come to work and work with everybody they're working with and serve all the people they're serving. And it's just a really beautiful environment that we have here. That a large part of that is because there is a focus on innovation and always trying to figure out how to do things better. Um, I'm looking forward to continuing to expand this idea of community informed practice. I think it's important for our field as a whole. We can not only do it in our own practices, but there are statewide public health approaches we can take and even national kind of training approaches we can take that are all focused in community informed practice, um, that I'm looking forward to being a part of and helping to continue to push. Um, and then in terms of our own specific work here, I'm really looking forward to continuing to build out sort of our holistic models. One of my big dreams is to get to the point where we're able to provide kind of medical support for families in rural and under-resourced communities, because that's often a big issue, especially in terms of complex and dangerous behavior. Oftentimes, people who engage in these behaviors that have minimal, that have high support needs and sometimes minimal functional communication skills, what we find is when they're engaging in these sort of aggressive behaviors, many of them have some sort of undiagnosed medical condition that if we support and help improve, uh, then oftentimes those behavioral issues either decrease or even go away. That's not always the case, but that's the case often enough that that's a big focus that I really want us to push forward in. So that's more of a niche thing that we're looking to do. But yeah.
That's pretty fantastic, and it's nice to be able to sort of name what the dream is and what that looks like.
Yeah.
Don't name it, you can't tame it. So that's pretty fantastic. Curious, what level of collaboration do you have with other institutions across the country? You mentioned about community informed sort of practice. Is that something that is nuanced to just Triad, or is that something that you're trying to really spread the tentacles across, globally, and ideally, right?
Yeah, I mean, that's something we developed here. And it really hasn't been until the last year. There's been about a 5 to 6 year development process of what this model is. And it's not been until the last year that we've really started to talk about it much. And that's because we wanted to wait until we actually understood what it was and that you could actually do it well, that we could listen to the community members, we could have their hopes and dreams guide our practice. And what we found is when we've incorporated this, our practice has gotten more creative, our outcomes have gotten better, our clinicians have had more fun, and we've had a lot more contact with our community in terms of what that practice should be. So, we're still at the very ground level of what this is. There's a lot of growth to go through. We're certainly talking to other sort of partners around the country.
Yeah.
There are people who are very interested in this approach, and so I think there's a lot of growth that can come from this approach. But for us, that's got to be the focus. Is our field is in a state where we really need to be able to show that we can substantively engage with our community members, have them guide the practice, and then ultimately be held accountable for that practice by those communities that we're serving. So, um, all very new, but I think that there's a strong upside to being able to continue to kind of push and figure out how to scale this in a way that is more
Right.
efficient for other providers.
Absolutely. So how can folks continue to follow your work, the work of Triad? What's the best way to sort of keep tabs on a lot of the wonderful work you guys are doing?
Yeah, thanks for asking. We've got a pretty pretty good website through the Vanderbilt Kennedy Center. And that's actually a great website because it includes TRIAD and other sort of disability focused programs we have, but there's certainly a lot of TRIAD specific information there. Social media, we've got a pretty strong Facebook sort of group, and we put stuff out on Twitter as well. So, and then people can always just reach out to me if they have any questions or any interest in any of the work we're doing. I'm always happy to chat.
Wonderful. Well, we'll make sure that we put the link in the description in this video. So for those that have just sort of, if you found this content helpful for you, I mean, would you mind sharing it on social media? Would you mind amplifying it, sharing it with your network, even commenting, liking, subscribing, whatever it might be? I think that it really makes a difference. And especially when it comes to, I think, the overall kind of common denominator that what we talked about here today, Pablo, is just around how do we enhance access? What does that look like when you're proactively doing that at a grassroots level and doing it in a way that impacts overlooked, underserved communities? And I think this is something that's, like, as I mentioned, very near and dear to me. So I'm grateful when we have guests like you that can come on, that can share their passion, share their spirit. And my hope is that those that are viewing it will also get equally as excited and want to take action on it, because the more innovators, the more doers that we bring into the community, the better off we are. So I'm looking forward to having you come back on the show in the future. You're more than welcome to come on and share some new wins with us. But thanks again for all of your time, and look forward to catching up with you soon.
Yeah, sounds great. Thanks for having me.